for China to invade Taiwan, it has to deal with the issue of other countries, what the U.S. will do, what Japan will do, what Australia will do. How is the Chinese Communist Party working to factor that into the equation?
Well, it's always a factor, right? If you look at Chinese Communist Party diplomacy around the world, this is always priority number one, is to try to undermine any foreign government's support for Taiwan. This is every member of the Chinese Communist Party, and especially those who are working abroad. That's what they do. That really is a top priority for them. And it goes beyond the official government to government relationships. This is also something that you see happen in their people-to-people diplomacy and in the diplomacy between political parties, right? Because the Chinese Communist Party also reaches out to political parties that may not be in power today, but they know will be in the future. So this is a really big part of what they do. This is what the United Front Work Department is all about. But all the organs of the PLA, from the liaison department in the PLA is heavily focused on this. The international department, the Ministry of State Security, all the propaganda apparatus. This is a major focus. So they're constantly trying to get other countries to abandon Taiwan and to stay silent on Taiwan. And so they don't speak out on Taiwan's behalf, even though everybody can see Taiwan being bullied and coerced. But because they themselves are being bullied and coerced effectively, most of the time it's effective, they don't say anything. And that's exactly what Beijing wants. And so that's why, even though there's been a massive uptick in, aggressive military maneuvering around Taiwan and propaganda messaging since last year, very few countries have actually come out to express real sympathy for Taiwan. And even those countries that have, like Japan and Australia, aren't actually doing anything to help other than express, their sympathy. They're not actually sending military attachés to Taiwan or trainers or liaison officers or participating in exercises, anything like that. So unfortunately, political warfare works. Coercion works. The Chinese Communist Party is able to intimidate other governments and of course, private actors like, airlines, for example, major corporations, Hollywood, Silicon Valley, our major tech companies, Wall Street investing firms. They're able to very effectively manipulate them so they don't support Taiwan. And so that's a very serious issue. And in fact, there's an argument to be made that our entire U.S. government policy toward Taiwan is based on coercion. Strategic ambiguity, this idea that we're not going to treat Taiwan like a legitimate government and a legitimate country, even though it is, and even though for 30 years we did, from 1949 till 1979, we had an embassy in Taipei, and we had nuclear weapons deployed at Tainan Air Base, and we were ready to use them if China tried to invade. And then all of a sudden, overnight in 1979, we said, nope, Taiwan no longer exists as a country. It's no longer a government. Now the official U.S. position is strategic ambiguity, that we're not going to be clear anymore. We're not going to be truthful in our use of terminology. And so you'll see U.S. government officials, and they have to do this. I'm sure they don't want to, but they have to say the Taiwan authorities. They can't say the Taiwanese government. They can't even say Taiwanese. They say the Taiwans. Well, you would never say the Japans or the Canadas, right? You say the Japanese or the Canadians, right? But in Taiwan's case, they say the Taiwans. It's the strangest dang thing to talk to U.S. government diplomats when they talk about Taiwan, and to listen to some of their speeches when they give speeches about Taiwan, because they have to use this really convoluted language that's not truthful at all. And what is that based on? It's based on coercion, right? This is a concession that the U.S. government made to China, to the Chinese Communist Party, because they were afraid that if they didn't do that China might attack and there might be war. And so instead of basing our Taiwan policy as a country on what is in our national interests, what is true, what do we know to be true, what do we believe to be true, what do our principles and our values say, we have gotten into a position over the past 40 plus years now where we base it on fear. And the first question anybody in Washington asks when you try to present a new idea, like recently there was this debate that went on about getting rid of strategic ambiguity. And I think it's a very important debate and it's a very good debate to have. The first question most people asked was not, should we do that? Does that make sense? Is that rational? Would that be good for us? People don't ask that. People ask, well, if we do, what will Beijing do? How are they going to hurt us if we do that? That's the first thing people do. And that blinds them to all of their options, right? Because we're a superpower. We're a sovereign country. We should be able to make foreign policy based on our values, our principles, and on objective reality, the truth. But in this case, that has not yet happened.
Well, speaking of that reminds me of something Shelley was talking about.
Yeah, so
Global Times.
We've definitely been noticing a bunch of articles lately that are saying things like, the U.S. would lose a war with China over Taiwan. There was one published in the Global Times that kind of read like standard Global Times speak, incredibly dismissive of the Taiwanese government. Like, wouldn't call it the Taiwanese government.
The Taiwan's authorities.
Well, it didn't say that, but it was, accusing the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party, of, being chaotic and like wanting independence, and like the U.S. would be a fool to support them, and all this kind of stuff. And then, talking about how badly the U.S. would lose a war over Taiwan. And then at the bottom, you realize that the person who wrote this was not like the Global Times editor-in-chief. It was a retired U.S. Marine Corps officer.
Who's still active in the Pentagon.
He's currently like a civilian consultant for the Pentagon. But that wasn't the only one. That was just like a particularly like interesting example of this. There was also a New York Times opinion article that was criticizing Biden's Taiwan policy as being like chaotic and messy and reckless, because it was accusing Biden essentially of going back on strategic ambiguity. I mean, there's been a number of these in the last few weeks, and it's interesting to see them all kind of pop out right now. And we were having this conversation about whether this is kind of psychological warfare.
I think it's hands down, it's psychological warfare.
But I wanted to get your thoughts on that, Ian.
Yeah, there's no question that this is political warfare, is what they call it in PLA jargon, right? And that's psychological warfare. It's media warfare. They're trying to shape the narrative. They're trying to push a false narrative in this case, and they're using their lobbyists, many of whom are paid. Others are not paid. They're what Lenin would call useful idiots. They actually don't know the facts of the matter, but they've been told a certain number of things by their Chinese interlocutors, usually on trips to Beijing, and they believe them. People can be easily manipulated, especially when they go to China. This is something the Chinese Communist Party is very good at. They're very good at handling, manipulating foreigners and putting words in their mouth. They have a core group of people that this is all they do, right? All they do is handle foreigners. And their English is great. They're charming. They take them on these grand tours, and they talk about China's imperial past. And there's a lot of showmanship that's involved. There's a lot of whining and dining that's involved. And at the end of it, you see delegation after delegation come back to Washington or London or wherever they're from. And they're just simpering shadows of their former selves. And they just have all of this praise for a very ugly regime, which is engaged in some extremely ugly behavior, really terrifying behavior when you look at the genocide that's going on. And they can somehow look past that, and they don't see that anymore. and they actually end up becoming tools of Chinese Communist Party propaganda. I think that's what you're seeing there. Anybody serious who, and I'm not serious, right? I'm an amateur. I work at a think tank, right? But people who are in the U.S. government and in the intelligence community, those that I've read and those that I've talked to are in almost uniform agreement that the PLA could not successfully invade Taiwan today as long as the U.S. intervened, right? If the U.S. doesn't help Taiwan, then Taiwan's in big trouble. They're in big trouble. But if the U.S. does, then there's almost no question that Taiwan is safe, at least for the next 5 to 6 years. After that, the digital magic 8-ball that war gamers look into starts to become very hazy, and it becomes much more difficult to predict.